Oh,
yeah, we were in
all right.
Lecha.
Lech Lecha, indeed. We are, good morning, coming into Lech Lecha, or should I say going to Lech Lecha. So Lech Lecha is, of course, the parasha that begins the real journey of Avram, later to be renamed Avraham or Abraham. And we're going to look near the end of Lech Lecha for today's class. We're not going to look at his first entry into the land of Israel and all that entails. We're instead going to look at a very important requirement that God places upon Abraham and all of his children for all time, which is known as Brit Milah, circumcision. So we are on chapter 17, which on the Eitz Chaim Chumashim is on page 90. 90.
Actually, 70, 89. So
What's that? No. We're on page. Chapter 17 does begin on page 90. We're going to be on page 90 because we're going to begin on on verse number 9.
Okay.
Right. The first part of chapter 17 is simply a reminder that God is making a covenant and attaching the land to the children of Israel through, well, they're not called that yet, but we know eventually they'll be called the children of Israel. That God is making the covenant with Abraham again more explicit and connected to the land. But this time, unlike the very beginning, where God only asked him to move, he is now asking Abraham to do something a little more, shall we say, physical as his part of the bargain. Right? The very beginning of Lech Lecha, all God demanded of Abraham was to move, which wasn't exactly easy, and it's not a minor thing ever. And as someone who's moved far too many times in his life, I don't enjoy it. So I can appreciate that that was a big request that God made of Abraham. But I think that even though this next request takes a lot less time, it probably is considered to be a little bit greater of a request to make upon a man. So with that in mind, we're going to pick up on verse 9 of chapter 17. And I'm going to need a reader. Anyone?
I guess I can read.
Thank you, Judy. We're on page 90, chapter 17, verse 9.
Oh, we're reading the English, right?
Yes. Everyone is strongly encouraged to read the Hebrew, but as most of our class would then be taken up with the translation, without commentary, it's an unfortunate choice we have to make.
God further said to Abraham, "As for you, you and your offspring to come throughout the ages shall keep my covenant. Such shall be the covenant between me and you and your offspring to follow, which you shall keep. Every male among you shall be circumcised. You shall circumcise the flesh of your foreskin, and that shall be the sign of the covenant between me and you. And throughout the generations, every male among you shall be circumcised at the age of 8 days. As for the homeborn slave and the one bought from an outsider who is not of your offspring, they must be circumcised, homeborn and purchased alike. Thus shall my covenant be marked in your flesh as an everlasting pact. And if any male who is uncircumcised fails to circumcise the flesh of his foreskin, that person shall be cut off from his kin. He has broken my covenant."
Okay, so what is the word of the day? A covenant, right?
Covenant.
Notice these things whenever you're reading through a piece of text. If the Torah decides to repeat the same word a dozen times in fewer than a dozen sentences, it's kind of trying to make a point here. And it's even more because there is a usage of the word covenant, obrit, that gets translated as, what was the term they used? Was it? Yes, everlasting pact at the end of verse 13. I guess because the translator got tired of writing the word covenant over and over again. But it's brit olam, right? It's an eternal covenant. It's an everlasting covenant. What is a covenant?
Promise.
A promise? A contract?
Agreement.
Okay, so what is a contract? Let's start with that as another good C word. Just a definition. If you were to look it up in Webster's, please don't. What would you actually see as a definition of a contract?
An agreement.
An agreement
between parties.
I don't know how many parties, it could be a lot.
Between parties, very good. And what would the nature of that agreement be? So is this a contract, right? We agree,
This is your expertise.
right? We agree that from now on, she will keep her dog on her lawn.
Definitely.
Is that a contract?
No.
No.
But it's an agreement. But is it a contract?
No,
Yes.
because only one party's bound.
Okay, only one party is bound. All right. So thank you. I'm glad we have a lawyer here today. Right? It's an agreement, and that's fine, but only one party is bound. And it may be a very good agreement, depending upon your relationship with your neighbors, but it's still just an agreement, not a contract. What if it was, from now on, you will keep your dog on your property, I'll keep my dog on my property? Now we've got the makings of a contract. Now we could then dress it up with, more penalties or rewards for fulfillment of the contract. This is what we're more used to when we talk about like commercial contracts, right? You agree to paint my house. I agree to pay you X money for the payment or for the painting that you're doing, right? That is a nice classic commercial contract. Great. What's a covenant? Is it just a fancy word for contract?
Commitment.
Okay, so it's a commitment, but it's classically considered to be a commitment that goes beyond the specified terms of a contract. Right? So one of the more classic examples is considered to be a marriage. A marriage is usually considered to be a covenant rather than a contract. Because after all, when you get married, no matter how carefully you draw up any sort of prenuptial agreement of who's taking out the trash on which days and who's taking care of the dog and who's cooking the meal and who is, who gets first dibs on vacation choices, you can come up with all of those kinds of things and even shake on it and sign on it and have a giant list of all of the do's and don'ts of both sides of the marriage. Once you actually get married, there's going to be more that comes up. And if it's a good marriage, you're not going to say, well, it doesn't appear in the document, so I guess neither of us have any responsibility for taking care of this, right? If you totally left out gardening, all right, you're not responsible for gardening, I'm not responsible for gardening, our contract doesn't make anyone responsible for gardening, so I guess we just let the garden.
But that can happen in a contract too. When you enter into a business contract, there'll come up stuff that's not.
Absolutely. And if something comes up and we need to deal with it, what do we have to do?
You have to
Amend the contract, right? And that emendation has to be agreeable to both parties, right? If while painting my house, you come across like some massive dry rot in the wall or something and you're going to have to replace that, well, that wasn't part of the original contract. But before you fix that, you have to agree with, I have to agree with you that you're going to do it and it's going to cost this amount, it'll take this long, and then we agree and we add a little emendation and good, the contract's amended. That doesn't happen every time something new comes up in a marriage. At least, God help you if that happens every time something new comes up in a marriage. Instead, there is an implicit understanding that the terms of the relationship begin with the explicit statements, but will continue into the realm of implicit needs as well. So when God is establishing a covenant with Abraham, he is not simply saying, this is all I'm asking, right? He's saying, you will follow in my ways, and there will be signs and reminders of following in my ways, but the signs and the reminders are not all of my ways, they are some of my ways. And as we go on with this relationship, more things are going to come up. And similar to, God is not getting himself hemmed in to promise only a particular litany of blessings. He is instead saying, there will be blessing. And that is a very open-ended, implicit gift rather than an explicit of, you will precisely have X, Y, and Z on these dates of the month. You need to see sort of what the covenant means here. Covenants are much harder, though, than a contract because A, you have to have a relationship, whereas in a contract, you can simply have a transaction, right? If you contract for someone to paint your house, you really don't need to have a relationship with the painter. I still encourage human relationships, even when doing contractual work, but technically it's not needed. If you get someone to change the oil on your car, you don't need to know about their kids. You don't need to know about where they went for vacation, and they don't need to know about you and what you do. It's just you show up, they do the thing, you pay, you leave. End of any relationship. In a covenant, you have to have a relationship before, during, and hopefully forever. that is going to be the support structure for this covenant to continue to take shape and be meaningful in guiding the relationship.
I'm trying to figure out how this applies, but there were always, in certain, like in La Jolla, that we said Jews, Hispanics, blacks could not live in La Jolla because there was a covenant in their
the sale of a house
that they could not sell to, and that was called a covenant.
Yes. I believe that was because it was a above and beyond establishing a requirement that was not specifically linked to the normal buy and sell of a house, right? Normally we buy and sell a house, you're not establishing a relationship, you're just establishing the transfer of property for money. The covenant that limited where people could live were trying to establish the relationship extending beyond the transaction, right? That from now on, it's not just that you bought a house from me. Because of our new relationship, both being white people, we've established that our relationship will preclude anyone else from ever buying this. That is going beyond the normal status of a contract, right? Normally, if I buy something, you don't get to tell me what to do with it.
Right.
But if we have a relationship, then yeah, I do have a responsibility to maintain that that agreement that we had.
I always thought it was strange that was called covenant.
Well, because it's more than a contract. It happened to be for a very bad reason, but it was still more than a contract. All right.
Okay.
So we've got the basic idea here of a covenant, and that the covenant is going to be a covenant that will be forever a covenant, and that this covenant is going to be part of the covenant of circumcision, and in the circumcision, the covenant will be seen. Right? Lots of words, covenants here. Okay. So how does that work, and why? Of all the things God could ask Abraham to do to establish a sign of the covenant between them, why this? Right? How about, a nice handshake, right? Or a particular, I don't know, anything. What? Or an earring. Well, that is actually a sign later on when it comes to slaves who wish to stay beyond the sabbatical year. They do get a hole in their ear. So a number of our sages have tried to look into this and this whole notion of covenant. But, well, I'll save the but until after we finish this part. All right, so Judy, if you're ready to read on the top, this is the page without the picture.
Okay. Although there are other symbolic acts which are signs of the covenant and the obligation to keep the laws of the Torah, such as the phylacteries,
Tefillin,
the fringes,
tzitzit,
the Sabbath,
Shabbat,
etc.
right? All of those are using the same term, ot, right? That these are a sign of the covenant that are mentioned in other parts of the Torah.
This symbol is by far the most potent one, the only one to be performed on one's body. The other signs are only a reminder. This is the only such sign to be performed on one's body. Right?
That he really, Radak wants to make us understand that, yes, we have lots of oath, right? There are lots of signs. When we wear tefillin, when we wear a tzitzit, when we are observing Shabbat, when we sing Vishamru, right? Od hi leolam, right? This is an eternal sign. Those are all signs, but there are signs and then there are signs. That there are signs that are reminders, and it's, oh yes, that's right. When I'm celebrating Shabbat, I should not only be celebrating Shabbat, I should be remembering the covenant, right? Shabbat is not just a set of contractual obligations. So Shabbat is a reminder of the covenant, which means as I perform those obligations or refrain from performing other actions, I should be remembering the relationship that is established with the covenant. And that's great. Same thing when I'm wearing tefillin, same thing when I'm wearing the talit. They are in and of themselves commandments or obligations, but they are also reminders of the broader relationship in ways that some other commandments don't quite always kick into our head to remember. But this one is one that isn't tied to us doing something in order to generate the reminder. This is something tied to our bodies which cannot be undone, and therefore is a permanent and more powerful, perpetual, and any other P words you wish to throw in there, reminder. Right? And because it's on our body and not limited, therefore, to our action, it is a reminder of the covenant that is indelible, that is much, much more powerful. All the other ones, again, as I said, if you choose not to celebrate Shabbat, not to wear tzitzit, not to wear tefillin, then you will not have those reminders in front of you. But if you have been circumcised at 8 days old, for the rest of your life, you will have that sign with you forever. Make sense? Okay.
I think the females would be without a sign forever then, right?
The females are not given a sign that is
Attached to the body.
that is attached to the body. Correct. Right. So there isn't a physical sign that is attached to the body, which will probably, like, we can connect that to the next commentary.
A symbol and a sign that I am the master and you are my servants, and the sign is sealed in a private place that will not be seen. The reason for this is so that the non-Jewish nations of the world won't say that the Jews are blemished.
All right. So Bechor Shor, he's tackling another aspect of this, which is, okay, God wants us to have a sign that is embedded into our bodies. Why not have us cut off a pinky like the Yakuza, used to do, right? Why not have us put a big brand, just newborn baby and just, brand their forehead with, a giant Star of David or whatever you want. Why not have some other form of sign that is more visible? Why hide the sign? Why bury the symbol of the covenant so that other people can't see it? And his answer is, because if you had it as some external form of maiming, then all the other nations would say, man, have you seen how those Jews mutilate themselves? Right? That's nasty. I mean, that guy over there, he's like missing an ear because he's Jewish, and that's what Jews do. They cut off babies' ears, and that would be disturbing, and it should be disturbing. And indeed, not only Bechor Shor, but many other commentators point out that the particular act that God has asked us to do is the one thing that we can spare from our bodies, apart from like fingernails and hair, that we do not suffer because of the loss of. That if you take away a finger, if you take away an ear, you take away an eye, you brand somebody in some way, there is permanent damage done and a permanent loss of some form or another to that person. But circumcision does not actually diminish a person's capacity to use the organ, either for procreation or for appropriate recreational usage.
Israel, in the army, when they test you for medical,
Mm-hmm.
the highest score you can get is 97. The 3, because of that.
They take 3%
Yeah.
off because of circumcision.
Yeah.
I think that's some inside joke there, right there.
No, this is it. Nobody can get 100. 97 is the highest.
Well, maybe they're just trying to do that so that no one complains that they didn't get 100.
The women can.
Okay, so to come back to the women's side, right? Bechor Shor and the other commentators argue that were there to be a comparable demand upon girls, that there is nothing on a woman that is extraneous. There is no leftover bit. And yes, maybe the appendix and something, but that's not something that you can easily do as an 8-day-old surgery. So if you were to take a woman and to circumcise her in some other form, you would be irreparably damaging her, and that is forbidden. So yes, there's a reason why women don't have this particular sign, because only men have the piece that's available for removal. Does that make sense? Without damaging the actual person. But it's actually important to remember, not that it's the focus of today's lesson, but there are people to this day who are very adamant that they believe it does damage, and they are working on laws around the world to try and prohibit Jews from doing circumcision. Brit Milah has always been something that, despite what Bechor Shor thought, really, really annoys a certain segment of the anti-Semitic non-Jewish population. And so it is something that we have had to defend, often with our lives, in order to continue this mitzvah to go to the next generation. So if you are at all interested in Judaism, please make sure that you are politically active, at least on the issue of Brit Milah, to ensure that it can still be done freely in any place that Jews live. That's the only political ad we're going to get for today. Abraham supports this political message. Okay, but Now I want to change gears and stay in the same gear. Covenant, but a different moment of covenant. As I mentioned a few weeks ago, and we'll continue doing, I'd like to bring in more pieces of other parts of the Tanakh to fill out our understanding of the rest of the Bible. And we have a little section here taken from the book of Psalms. And those of you that are frequent attendees for our holiday services, you'll recognize this as being part of the second paragraph of Hallel. And as you can see, Hayam, Hayam, Ravayanos, Hayaden, Isob Leachor, right? Sound a little familiar to those of you who come for services? Excellent. Now take a look at the English. Judy, if you wouldn't mind.
The sea saw it and fled. The Jordan turned backward. The mountains skipped like rams, the hills like young sheep. Why do you flee? See, Jordan, that you turn backward?
All right, so we probably understand half of that, which is, what are we talking about when the sea saw and fled? What Yam is most famous for running away from God? Yam Suf, right? The Sea of Reeds, the sea when we crossed out of Egypt, right? Everybody remembers all the movies and all the art of the parting of the sea, the crossing of the sea. Great. But the Yarden, the Jordan? No, when did the Jordan ever turn backwards?
When
Last time was 1929.
Joshua.
Exactly right. So, but here what we're talking about is the crossing of Joshua. So there are many parallels in the first few chapters of the book of Joshua to the Exodus from Egypt. And in this particular case, what the Bible tries to do is actually provide sort of bookends, that we begin the Exodus with the parting of the sea, and we end the Exodus with the parting of the Jordan River. And the Jordan River has to part in order to allow us to move into the land of Israel. Before we get into the actual text of the story and a few other of the commentaries about it, it's important to understand why this is necessary. The people were crossing just north of the Dead Sea, near the town of Jericho. Has anyone ever seen the Jordan River? Good, a few people, yes. How would you describe the Jordan River compared to other rivers?
Well, today it's not much.
Today it's not much, right?
Yeah. Who knows how it was years ago?
Well, we do have archaeology which says, yes, it was probably a little more active in the past, but not a whole lot.
Yeah, it'd be more like a stream than if you've seen the Mississippi, that's a river.
That's
Compared to the Mississippi, compared to the Rio Grande, I mean, this is not a major river, right? If you zoom out the map, it disappears really, really fast off the map, because it's not much, which means that crossing the Jordan probably would not have normally been such a big deal. There's no other indication that crossing between Israel and what we now call Jordan, of course the Jordan River was a big issue, and in fact they made bridges and all sorts of things in antiquity as well. This was not a river that was insurmountable. However, the people were crossing the Jordan River right during the month of Nisan. We know that because they're about to celebrate Passover for the first time in the land of Israel. So what happens in springtime?
Floods.
Exactly. We have all the winter melt up in the north.
That's me. That's my fault.
Okay. all the rain that falls up in the north, all of that is coming down, and all of the rain on the Judean hills is coming down. This is when the cisterns would be filling that were used by the desert communities in the Judean wilderness. And this was a time when the river would have been swollen to its maximum capacity. So it's actually a time when you really would need help crossing over the river, where you couldn't just, wade through the river up to your chest and make it to the other side. We're going to need a bridge or some form of crossing. Now, we could wait, but there's a problem with that. Military. If you want to run a military campaign, when do you go out to war?
When it's dry.
Well, when it's dry-ish, right? So springtime is usually when you want to get going, right? Because if you wait till winter, it's no good, right? And if you are in the middle of the summer harvest, usually you want your people busy harvesting. So spring was often considered a good time for going out to do battle. But the Jordan provided a natural barrier for the people who lived in Jericho and the rest of Canaan. So even though they are afraid, as we talked about with the story of Rachav, even though they're afraid of the Israelites, they're probably sitting behind the swollen Jordan River going, we're good. We got at least like 3 months before they can probably try to cross that. And we can prepare for them in that time. And whoop, all of a sudden the Israelites start crossing over the Jordan River. That would have dismayed them greatly, which is why the psalm is written as talking about the dismay, right? Why did you turn back? It's why did you flee? These are military terms for the route of the oceans, the route of the river, trying to emulate the feelings that would have been among the defenders of the land of Canaan. Okay, so how did this work? Well, we're going to get the Midrash version, and then we're going to read a little bit from the book of Joshua itself. So now we're in Sota in the Talmud.
Our rabbis taught, how did Israel cross the Jordan? Each day during the journey in the wilderness, the ark journeyed behind 2 standards. But on this day of crossing, it journeyed in front, as it is said, behold, the ark of the covenant of the Lord of all the earth passeth over before you. Each day the Levites carried the ark, but on this day the priests carried it. As it is said, and it shall come to pass, when the soles of the feet of the priests that bear the ark of the Lord.
All right, so which ark of the Lord are we calling? What is this?
The Ark of the Covenant.
The ark of the what?
Covenant.
Covenant, our word of the day. I need that Groucho Mark. You said the word of the day. All right, covenant, the Ark of the Covenant. It's not only from Indiana Jones movies. The Ark of the Covenant is prominent in this particular passage. And you'll notice that the Talmud is recognizing that there's something different going on here. Whenever we were marching through the wilderness, the ark was always guarded, if you will. That is to say, there were legions in front and legions behind and legions on the side. We marched as a unit. Here, however, the ark is going first. And here also, unlike in the wilderness, it's not being carried just by the Levites, it's being carried by the Kohanim. And that is a significant change. And that is going to be the marker. As the covenant, the Ark of the Covenant goes forward to the river, that's where the river is going to stop. Remember, we don't have Moses anymore, but what do we have? The covenant. The covenant. The covenant, right? The word of the day. The covenant. So we had a secret covenant, that is to say the Brit Milah, which is something that is done in a private place. And here we have a very public sign of the covenant, the giant gold ark that is being carried now at the forefront as it's going out. Okay, but let's take a look a little bit at the text from Joshua chapter 4.
The Lord spoke to Joshua, saying, take 12 men out of the people, out of every tribe a man, and command them, saying, take you out of the midst of the Jordan, out of the place where the priest's feet stood, 12 stones made ready, and carry them over with you, and lay them down in the lodging place where you shall lodge this night.
All right. So plan is, as you're crossing, 12 guys, it's your job to pick up big rocks. All right, we're going to get 12 big rocks, and where we make camp tonight on the other side of the Jordan, which will be in the land of Israel, then we're going to need those rocks. So designated 12 rock getters, one for each of the tribes. Make sense? Okay, onward.
Then Joshua called the 12 men and said unto them, pass on before the ark of the Lord your God into the midst of the Jordan, and take you up every man of you a stone upon his shoulder, according unto the number of the tribes of the children of Israel, that this may be a sign among you, that when your children ask in time to come, saying, what mean you by these stones?
Just pause real quick. Is ringing any bells? So first of all, yes, it's another sign that's going to be done by these stones. But the whole children thingy? Passover, exactly, right? This is the exact same style of language that we get that eventually leads us to the Seder. It's the same language that was used in Exodus and other parts of the Torah that our kids are going to ask us about what this all means. And we should answer them in particular ways. If you're unsure of where those all come, that's the 4 questions, right? There's 3 explicit questions and 1 implicit questions, which is why we get 4 answers. And that's part of our Seder now. So what do we say to them?
Then you shall say to them, because the waters of the Jordan were cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord, when it passed over the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off. And these stones shall be for a memorial to the children of Israel forever. And the children of Israel did so as Joshua commanded.
All right, so we actually followed orders. Interesting little side note, there's some argument among different commentaries of which was the greater miracle, the parting of the sea or the parting of the Jordan. And one camp says, well, the parting of the sea was greater because there we know that the water was held back on both sides. And on the parting of the Jordan River, the water was held back only on one side, right? To which the other side argues, but that's just the way rivers work, right? If you stop the river here, you don't have to worry about the river coming backwards, right? Because the water that is not joining it just drains down and is gone. That's just how rivers work. It doesn't make it less miraculous. So it's one of those lively debates that both sides agree it was important and miraculous. It's just interesting to consider the different details. All right. So, and it came to pass. Oh, no, I'm sorry. Joshua also.
Joshua also set up 12 stones in the midst of the Jordan, in the place where the feet of the priests that bore the Ark of the Covenant stood, and they are there unto this day.
Right, so we now get a different set of stones that are set up actually in the riverbed, that were set up to mark the crossing point.
And it came to pass, as the priests that bore the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord came up out of the midst of the Jordan, as soon as the soles of the priests' feet were drawn up onto the dry ground, that the waters of the Jordan returned unto their place.
Right, the priests lead. Right, so maybe it's sort of we got the Jordan River, right, and over here is Jordan, and over here is Israel. Just using the modern names for the countries or territory rather, and the river coming this way. So the priests bring the ark here. And then all the people pass before them. And my phone rings. That's going to be I'll call you back. Boom. So people pass before them. And then once the last person has come across, then the priests come over and join them. Now, there is a little commentary argument about this, of whether the priests joined them on this side, or whether the priests actually went back to this side and then flew across. But that's a midrash that we don't have time to go into. Well, the idea being that they had carried the ark and now the ark carried them. But that's a textual argument that we don't have time for because it takes away from our discussion of the covenant. So, but that's basically the physics of this, is that we now have stones that are piled there, and we now are here, and we have our stones that are going to be ready to pile in some fashion once we make camp for the night in the land of Israel for the first time. We good? Okay. So we got dry priests now, and the people came up.
And the people came up out of the Jordan on the 10th day of the first month, and encamped in Gilgal on the east border of Jericho. And those 12 stones which they took out of the Jordan, Joshua set up in Gilgal. And he spoke unto the children of Israel, saying, when your children shall ask their fathers in time to come, saying, what mean these stones? Then you shall let your children know, saying, Israel came over this Jordan on dry land. For the Lord your God dried up the waters of the Jordan from before you until you were passed over, as the Lord your God did to the Red Sea.
Just in case you missed the connection.
Which he dried up from before us, until we were passed over, that all the peoples of the earth may know the hand of the Lord, that it is mighty, that you may revere the Lord your God forever.
Right. So could God have gotten us over the Jordan River without doing this? Could God have gotten us through the Yam Suf without doing this? Of course. But God needed to do this to show that there was a special connection going on here, in order that the other nations would recognize what was happening, ideally to avert the war that's about to happen, because they would recognize it and say, okay, yeah, God kind of really on your side, so we're backing off. Unfortunately, that didn't happen, but God is going to every length to try and make people realize what's really going on here in order to spare the conflict. And this is a second reminder of what we're going to be sharing with our kids whenever we point at those stones. Anyone ever seen the stones at Gilgal? No, they're not there anymore. But that doesn't mean that they weren't there. Very interestingly, if you look at the mosaic on the right-hand side, this is an extreme close-up of the map of Madaba, which is in the country of Jordan. There is a Christian church there that's from the 5th, 6th century, and they have a huge mosaic that covers the entire area from like Lebanon all the way down to the Nile Delta. And the mosaic is laid out as a map with notes in Greek of what all the different sites are. There's like more than 100 or something different cities and places that are marked on this. It's had some historical damage, unfortunately, so it's not entirely intact. But there are a lot of interesting things. And if you look right in the middle of this map, underneath the Greek, there's a little house-looking shape there with a bunch of boxes in front of it. Everyone see that right in the center? How many boxes are there? 12. That is Gilgal, right? That is their map location for Gilgal. Now, what's that? Well, no, this is the one that was on land. Right, on the landmark was still known, presumably. The map has been shown to be fairly accurate, so we're not 100% sure whether this meant that the stones were still visible 1,500 years ago, or whether this was the remembrance of where the stones had once been. But other things on the map, like roads and such, have actually led archaeologists to find those places. So there's at least a possibility that the stones of Joshua may have actually still stood by the time this map was made, which was, like I said, only about 1,500 years ago. But we're not sure. But the idea of the stones, of course, was to proclaim the covenant, right? Was to proclaim the connection. This is fulfilling what was discussed in Deuteronomy when Moses made the commandment that when we got across the river, we would set up these stones and we would also write upon these stones all the words of the Torah. So this was like having your perfect shared copy of the text. That the entire Torah would be written across these stones, so that anybody who wanted to know the Torah could go and actually see the stones, and they would be able to get a true copy. And no one else would be able to make changes in their copy of the Torah, because you could always take their Torah, go over to the stones, and compare, and go, wait a minute, you edited that, right? You added someone in, or you took something out. The stones would be there as a permanent way to make sure that the Torah wasn't altered. At least that was the goal.
So when you say stones, it should be extremely large.
Well,
If you're the,
largish.
you know.
I mean, you think about how long a modern Torah scroll is.
Right.
It's not like Stonehenge large. Right. Depending upon how big your carving skills are. Although this would have actually been on a plaster.
Didn't they say I've always
12 guys carrying them.
You had to. They said you were carrying it on your shoulder.
Yep.
Which means they had to be large. I mean, it wasn't like a small stone that you carried.
Yeah, they weren't picking up river rocks. These are substantial rocks, right? Yeah. So they're not, like I said, they're not Stonehenge-sized stones, but they're also not little smooth rocks from the bottom of the river. These would have been hefty slabs that would have then been, according to other parts, would have been covered in plaster, and the inscription of the Torah would have been put on it. We good?
They had to be manageable by what? Yeah.
It seems to be that way, yes. That seems to be the implication. Okay. So, why are we writing on these stones? Well, let's see what Abarbanel has to say about that.
Write the Torah on the stones. All this is similar to the actions of the previous generation when standing at Mount Sinai when they received the Torah. It combines with fulfilling the mitzvah, you shall write them upon the doorposts of your house and upon your gates. Therefore they are commanded that when they cross over the Jordan, they should write the Torah on these stones in the manner of a mezuzah on the gate through which they are entering.
All right, so interesting little idea that these stones were like a super mezuzah, right? A mezuzah has only a few paragraphs in it, and it sits at the corner of our gates and at the doorposts of our homes. But this would have been like the whole thing as a giant mezuzah, which reminds us then, what is a mezuzah's purpose? Apart from fulfilling the commandment that you should have a mezuzah. To remind us, exactly, right? The mezuzah is not an amulet, it's not a good luck charm. The mezuzah is a reminder of the covenant. And the idea here is that these stones were being used as a reminder of the covenant by having the actual details of the covenant written upon them. Good? Good. Which brings us to something we actually have in the book, which means I didn't have to go over 2 pages, to page 1300 in the Chumash.
If there's only a reminder, though, how come they had to write the whole thing? Wasn't it supposed to be like a check on the?
Well, yeah, I mean, but it's a reminder doesn't mean that it has to be shorter, right? It means that in addition to having the purpose for which it was made, it has an additional purpose of also being a particular type of reminder of something. So in this case, the reminder of the covenant was more than just a literal checklist, copy editor, but it was also a reminder of the crossing and all of that. 1,300.
So what was the point of them putting it in the water? Going in the water to read it?
Those were just a marker of where the crossing had happened. Exactly, where the priest had stood. What's that? These are a different set of stones. Exactly. So depending upon your reading, there's either 2 or 3 sets of stones, because it's impossible to read an implication that there was another set of stones set up in Moab on the other side of the Jordan. We have the one that's set up actually in where the river flows, and then we have this one set up in Gilgal. Okay, but we need to understand, why is Gilgal called Gilgal? And that is going to take us on page 1300 to chapter 5. So we don't need to read the chapter 3 bit. We're just going to jump to the chapter 5 at the bottom of the page.
At that time, the Lord said to Joshua, "Make flint knives and proceed with a second circumcision of the Israelites." So Joshua had flint knives made, and the Israelites were circumcised at Gibeat Ha'aralot.
It's always easier in the Hebrew.
Right, here
exactly.
it is.
Yes. Okay, so wait a minute. How do you do a second circumcision? Right? It's like once you've removed the foreskin, there's nothing left.
Just a little drop of blood.
So one theory might be hatafat tambrit, which is done if somebody, for example, wants to convert to Judaism but was already circumcised before they became Jewish. We do a symbolic taking of blood, just a little poke, usually with like one of those sort of blood-taking needle, poke, and a little bit of is there. It doesn't have to be a lot.
No flint knives.
No flint knives. Hold on, wait.
Today.
Before we knock the flint knives, right? Before we knock the flint knives, it was actually the sharpest surgical material they had, right? You want to try and sharpen up bronze to be like razor sharp? Doesn't happen, right? If you want something that's razor sharp 2,000, 3,000 years ago, there's no stainless steel, right? There's no carbon fiber, there's no hybrid ceramic compound. You got a rock that you can sharpen like that. It's called flint, or if you live in other parts of the world, obsidian. And that's it. Everything after that, you're not getting your nice sharp pocket knife. So flint makes absolute sense here, and it's not meant to be primitive. This is actually an upgrade over what you normally would use for a knife. Okay, back to our commentary though to understand this second circumcision. So we're going to read from Rashi.
There had already been a circumcision. On the night of their departure from Egypt, a large assembly were collectively circumcised.
Right. So while we were in Egypt, circumcision wasn't necessarily happening. Before we leave Egypt, everyone who was there at the time got circumcised. Keep going.
And this was the second time, because during the entire 40 years that they were in the wilderness, the north winds did not blow for them, and they did not have a suitable day to circumcise themselves, as we learned in Yevamot 71b.
Which is the Talmud. And in case you were trying to figure out what in the world the north wind blowing has to do with anything circumcisional. Keep reading. This is from the Talmud's explanation.
Certain atmospheric conditions were beneficial for the healing of the wound caused by circumcision. The north wind created this condition. These winds were withheld during the 40 years in the wilderness in order that the clouds of glory that led and protected the people would not disperse.
Okay, so God had to make a compromise, which was there was going to be this anan, this cloud of glory that was protecting us during our trip through the wilderness. But that cloud, if the north wind was blowing, would get pushed away. And without the north wind, there was not considered to be the right conditions for the healing of the circumcision wound. So therefore, because it was dangerous to either do without the north wind or to do without the cloud, we simply went 40 years without doing circumcision. Which means now that we're about to enter the land of Israel, there's a lot of overdue circumcision needed.
Yeah, especially when most of the people died already.
Well, that's the whole point.
Yeah.
Everyone who was,
Yeah.
exactly, everyone who was under the age of 20 was still alive, but anyone who was born for the last 40 years has not been circumcised, which means that it mounts up. And if I can just find my spot really quickly. And the circumcision is on it's for the land, you raise them up and circumcise. Where's the I'm trying to find my verse. I knew I should have written it down to where I wanted to go, but I said, oh, it's in the book, it's not a problem. The problem is that when they do the circumcision, there are so many circumcisions that they end up making a mountain. A small hill, I guess you should, I would say.
Of what, the foreskin?
Of the foreskins, exactly. There were lots of them. But let's go ahead and take a quick look then at page 1301, but take a look at 8, verse 8, and we're going to read verse 8 and verse 9. After the Judy?
After the circumcising of the whole nation was completed, they remained where they were in the camp until they recovered. And the Lord said to Joshua, "Today I have rolled away from you the disgrace of Egypt." So that place was called Gilgal, as it still is.
Right, so galoti is the word that's being used for roll away, and that's used now as the basis for the word Gilgal. So that we understand why Gilgal is called Gilgal. And this place where the stones of the covenant are going to sit is now connected also to the circumcision of the covenant. So we've got double reminders that are overlapping at this one spot for the covenant. Make sense? Ish? Okay. And there's my little handout. And if you read our last Rashi, we'll explain why this took place right here.
After this speech, he circumcised them. He said to them, "Do you think you will inherit this land while you are yet uncircumcised? Was it not said to Abraham, 'And you will preserve my covenant, and I will give you and your descendants after you the land of your sojournings'?"
Right, so way back in Genesis 17, God explains that part of this covenant is circumcision, and part of this covenant is God giving us the land, or giving the land to Abraham's descendants. We need to be fully compliant with our part of the covenant for God to be compliant with his. And so as we come across into the land, we need to make sure that now that we're no longer reliant upon the cloud, and now that we can allow the north wind to come, meaning that now that it's safe medically to do the circumcision, that we need to do this at our first opportunity. And that, by the way, continues to be the rule for circumcision in the modern world, which is that 8 days is the first time to do the mitzvah. If medically there is an issue, it is postponed until it is medically safe to do a circumcision. And we see that being played out on the national stage in this section of the Torah, and reminding us of these different forms of the covenant, of the covenantal reminder. Right, between Brit Milah, between the Ark of the Covenant, between the stones that were placed at the spot of Gilgal, we have reminder after reminder after reminder. But of those reminders, of the ark, of the stone, of circumcision, which one do we still have?
That's what-
Still circumcision, right? Brit Milah is still the Brit Olam, right? Is still the everlasting reminder of the covenant. Because it's the one thing that we've always had control over, right? We haven't always had control over the land of Israel. We certainly haven't always had control over the Ark of the Covenant itself. And even the stones that were set up, they have long since vanished from the face of the earth. But circumcision, Brit Milah, this continues to be a sign that has been passed down unbroken for 3,000 years. And that is a blessing to us and a blessing that we give to our descendants. Any questions? All right, great. Take care, everyone. Keep studying. I hope you enjoy our little dips into